So I don't know how the isolation of coronavirus is affecting you, but for me, it's becoming a challenge. I'm definitely not used to working from home. I'm not used to being indoors this much, especially not with my kids always around and always with me. I'm finding myself, I get irritable quicker. I get frustrated faster. I find myself trying to figure out kind of who I am and what life looks like right now, and it's bringing my frustrations much quicker to the surface. Even this video, man, I've tried to record this now 4 times, and I've had technical difficulties each time, and it's been a bit of a frustrating experience. My wife and I are quickly finding that there's a reason we don't homeschool our kids. The arrangement of our kids being in school for most of the day and us picking them up in the afternoon and parenting until bedtime is the kind of parenting we signed up for. But coronavirus has changed our life for the time being. In the midst of all this, I'm trying to find rhythm and trying to look to Jesus and the ways of Jesus and navigate what God might be doing in this time. And today I wanted to look with you at a few parables in the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, in chapter 4. The first of which is a parable talking about a farmer who scatters seed. If you would look at this with me, Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 3, Jesus says this, "Listen to this. A farmer went out to scatter seed, and as he was scattering seed, some fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it. Others fell on rocky ground where the soil was shallow. They sprouted immediately because the soil wasn't deep. The sun came up and scorched the plants, and they dried up because they had no roots. The other seed fell among thorny plants. The thorny plants grew and choked the seed, and they produced nothing. Other seed fell into good soil, and it bore fruit. Upon growing and increasing, the seed produced in one case a yield of 30 to 1, in another case a yield of 60 to 1, and in another case a yield of 100 to 1. Jesus said, whoever has ears to listen should pay attention." He goes on in verse 13 to say, "Don't you understand this parable? Then how will you understand all the parables? The farmer scatters the word. This is the meaning of the seed that fell on the path. When the word is scattered and people hear it, right away Satan comes and steals the word that was planted in them. Here's the meaning of the seed that fell on the rocky ground. When people hear the word and immediately receive it joyfully, because they have no roots that last for only a little while. When they experience distress or abuse because of the word, they immediately fall away. Others are like seeds scattered among thorny plants. These are the ones who have heard the word, but worries of this life, the false appeal of wealth, and the desire for more things break in and choke the word. It bears no fruit. The seeds scattered on good soil are those who hear the word and embrace it. They bear fruit. In one case, a yield of 30 to 1, in another case, 60 to 1, and in another case, 100 to 1. Jesus shares this parable and offers us 4 kinds of soils. And I would just push that maybe we should be reading this parable. What Jesus is really getting at is 4 kinds of souls, that the readers, the hearers of this parable are meant to do a little bit of self-reflection on what kind of soil or what kind of soul they bear. The first kind of soil is soil described as along the path, or a soul described as along the path. In this parable, the seed that falls along the path doesn't take root. It never gets inside the soul. And quickly birds come and eat this seed up, and the seed is gone as quick as it landed. See, in this parable, the soil or the soul doesn't even know the seed was ever there. I'm a person of privilege, and I think because of that, it's really important that I listen to this specific part of the parable. I think it's really easy for me, because of all the privileges in my life, to begin to be blind of the needs around me. See, so much of Jesus' teachings to the rich, to the privileged, is exactly this, is that God is working around you, that there are people around you that are in need, that people are around you that are in trouble, people around you that require something from you or require something of you, but you can't even see it because you're so insulated by privilege. So I pay attention to this because I have many check marks of privilege, right? I'm white, I'm male, I'm cis, I'm married and have 2 kids, 1 boy, 1 girl. I'm educated, I have a full-time job, I have a savings account, and it's really easy in my life to be insulated from people. And in much like right now where I've been physically isolated and physically insulated from people in this world, I think one thing that we could maybe realize during COVID-19 that maybe not much has changed. That when it became the rule or the law for us to be isolated from one another, yet we still don't see the needs of people around us, perhaps doing some soul work in this season to see how we might be the soul along the path or the soil along the path, that we can't even see what God is doing around us because we're so insulated in our own selves. The next kind of soil that Jesus talks about is soil, or a soul that he describes as rocky ground. I think this is like people, you're in it for a good time, but not for a long time. See, Jesus describes this as like, yeah, the seeds take root for a bit, and they even begin to sprout a little bit, but the sun comes and scorches the seed away, scorches the plant away. I think it's like, I'm into what God is calling me to do. I'm in to be a part of something when it's early and exciting. But as long as it doesn't get too hard, or as long as it doesn't begin to challenge my social position, as long as it still makes sense for me, as long as people still like me, or I don't break any of my social contracts, as long as it checks all of my moral boxes, and as long as all of those things are in place, then I'll stick along the path and I'll do the work that Jesus has asked me to do or invited me into. I think this rocky soil thing is important for us today, especially in this time, in the way media works in our social spheres and the amount of things we're consuming off a screen. I think for many of us, we're losing our ability for empathy and compassion, or maybe ability is the wrong word, but we're losing our longevity in empathy and compassion. See, I think we're being wired, right, to programmed to not have very much longevity. We see and read about COVID-19, we read about the coronavirus and how it's affecting people out there, right? We can read about New York City and the struggles of New York City. We can read about other countries that are experiencing this worse than we are. We can even read stories of people that we know who are experiencing this, but in the very next feed, and the very next thing might be that meme that brings us laughter, that joke about how we're getting dressed in the morning or not getting dressed in the morning because of COVID-19, the joke about being stuck at home with your family. And we just switch from what is immense pain and struggle in people's lives to the very next line being humor. And while that might be a nice escape, in the real life, moving on from compassion and empathy that quickly means that we often move on from the work of God that quickly. And my concern is what rocky soil looks like for us is this really short stream, this very short-lived empathy and compassion, that things can break our hearts for a moment, but then we can very quickly move on before that empathy or that compassion produces any fruit of care and generosity. The third kind of soil, or the third soul, is seeds that get planted among thorns. See, the seeds that get planted among thorns grow and even begin to produce some fruit, but eventually the thorns of life come up and capture the growth, capture the plant and kill it and pull it down and end the growth right away. I think this one is about when the way of Jesus begins to challenge the things that we want. Not the things that we think we want or say we want, or the things we perceive ourselves as wanting, but the things we actually want. Right? The way of Jesus, I think, often will bring us to a point where it might challenge my bank account, or my job, or the way I parent, or the way I treat my spouse or think of my spouse. It might begin to challenge the kinds of friends that I keep. It might begin to challenge the way I think about church or the way I want to experience my faith. It might begin to challenge the kinds of people who sit around my table. It might begin to challenge my home and what I do with my extra bedrooms. It might begin to challenge my car and how I use this privilege of driving. It might begin to challenge the way I think about my debt. It might begin to challenge the things that I draw significance from. It might begin to challenge my health and how I think about caring for myself. See, I think that the way of Jesus, when we begin walking down these roads and we begin to walk with people and engage in empathy and compassion, sometimes we can be so excited and we can begin to bear fruit, but then there's these limits and these ceilings that maybe begin to be challenged. And Jesus wants us to consider those thorns and how we might spend some time rooting up those thorns. But then Jesus talks about this fourth soil, this fourth soul, this soul that produces fruit, this soul that is soft and bears fruit 30 times, 60 times, or even 100 times. And as we read this parable, man, it'd be so nice to see ourselves as that kind of soil. As we look at this parable and we look at that fourth soil, I want to be helpful here, and I want to be clear that I don't think what Jesus is saying is that these are requirements for participation, right? These aren't a list of 4 laws where you are locked into the soil that you're in, but Jesus is inviting us to transformation. He's inviting us to change. See, after this point, Jesus goes on and shares some more parables, and these parables are meant to compel us. They're built to compel us to life in the kingdom, to perhaps beginning to see the world in a different way. That we begin to say, I want to be a part of Jesus's way of viewing the world, which requires me to look at my soul. It requires me to consider the soil of my soul. See, the next parable Jesus tells is this parable about a lamp. Right? It's this parable about a light. And he says, certainly if you have this light, you shouldn't be hiding it under a basket. Of course not. If you are a light and you are bringing light into darkness, then that needs to be seen by everybody. He goes on and he talks about a farmer who plants seeds, right? Another seed analogy. But what he talks about is this farmer, he works the soil. He works the soil, but the seeds, they grow while he sleeps. Do you hear Jesus inviting us to work our souls? And him responding, saying, you don't necessarily control your transformation, but as you do this work, while you sleep, I will begin to change you and transform you. And perhaps the things that you used to long for, you just don't long for anymore. He finishes with this parable about a mustard seed, and he describes a mustard seed as being the smallest of all seeds. And when it is planted in the garden, eventually that mustard seed grows into a mustard tree, which is the largest of all plants in the garden. And he says it's so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. So this is what I'm hopeful during this season. Is my hope is that communities of Jesus people, like people who want to live life on the way and in the way of Jesus, will become gardens of life, providing hospitality and shade to many during this time of need. That we would do the work in this time on our soul, and our return on investment would not be our own personal gain, but the ROI of this soul work would be love, a greater capacity to give our lives away. It's not my prayer that God would bless you with more, but rather he'd bless you with the realization of what you have, and that you have this capacity to live with less so that others might experience rest or might experience more. The question Jesus is asking throughout this is, will you have ears to hear? I think what he's saying is, does this sound like good news to you? Is this maybe something you want? And might you invite Jesus to work in your soul? Might you participate in this gardening? Might you become a different person in this time? Might you grow in your capacity for love this time and do the work? Where do you think your soul is today? Are you having a hard time seeing needs that are out there? Are you so caught up in your own life are so protected from pain that you can't see the needs that are out there? Do you find maybe your soul is rocky ground, that you get excited in a moment, or you feel compassion or empathy in a moment, but then quickly, very quickly, that compassion or empathy is gone and it's back to life as usual? Do you find your soul might be surrounded by thorns, and that you have so many concerns of what you might lose, that fruit that grows up and even action that begins to take place quickly is killed by the thorns and fears and concerns of your own life? Or perhaps you find that the soul of your life, the soil of your life, has been being worked, and you can actually feel God changing you and transforming you through this season. And it is my prayer and my hope that you will begin to see fruit 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And I'll close with this thought, that the idea here is not fruit for your own gain. This is not about your own prosperity. But as God changes you, you begin to see the fruit around you. It begins to service other parts of the garden. And you begin to take joy as the people around you are experiencing fruit that came from the work that God has done in you.